You hear it all the time, right? The economy's strong, jobs are up, everything's looking great. But what if that's not the whole story? Today, we're diving into the very different perspective of investor Peter Schiff. He's arguing that a major economic crisis isn't just possible, he thinks it's pretty much inevitable. So let's get into it. And this really is the big question. On one side, you've got the official reports all pointing to a healthy, growing economy. But on the other side, you have Peter Schiff sounding the alarm, kind of like he did before the 2008 financial crisis. He's convinced that the official numbers are painting a picture that's dangerously misleading. Let's break down why. All right, first up, we're going to look at what Schiff calls the economic illusion. The basic idea here is that all the positive headlines we're seeing are actually hiding some deep-seated weaknesses. Weaknesses that he believes are growing right under our noses. So the first thing Schiff attacks is the job market. Yeah, the official reports might be bragging about job growth, but he says you have to look at the kind of jobs being created. And what he sees isn't a rise in stable, full-time careers. Nope, he sees an explosion of part-time work, with more and more people having to juggle multiple jobs just to get by. To Schiff, that's not a sign of a strong economy, that's a sign of struggle. So why are people taking on all this extra work? Well, Schiff's answer is pretty simple. It's not about ambition, it's about desperation. He points to this massive surge in the cost of living. We're talking up to 40%. People aren't working 2 or 3 jobs to get ahead. They're doing it just to cover the absolute basics, like rent, food, and insurance. It's like running on a treadmill that's getting faster and faster just to stay in the same place. And if you want proof of that pressure, look no further. U.S. credit card debt has blown past a staggering $1 trillion. That's an all-time high. And what's really crazy is that this is happening while interest rates are through the roof. This isn't people buying fancy stuff. This is survival debt. And that brings us to what Schiff sees as the root of the problem, what he calls the debt and inflation trap. He basically argues that all this pressure on regular people is just a symptom of 2 much bigger issues that have been building up for years. Schiff uses this really powerful metaphor to describe the government's whole approach to the economy. He says that anytime there's a sign of weakness, the answer is always the same. Just print more money. Sure, it gives a short-term boost, a kind of high, but just like a drug, you need bigger and bigger doses over time to get that same effect, and that creates a really dangerous addiction. Now, the official fancy term for this is quantitative easing, or QE. But Schiff just says, let's call it what it is, money printing. And he argues this is the direct cause of inflation, which makes every dollar in your pocket worth less. It basically acts like a hidden tax, and it hits the poor and middle class the hardest because, most of their money goes toward necessities that are now way more expensive. And the scale of this whole thing is just mind-boggling. The U.S. now spends over $1 trillion a year, not paying down the debt itself, but just on the interest payments. Schiff warns this whole thing is on a dangerous path, where that interest payment could soon be the government's single biggest expense. Bigger than Social Security? Maybe even bigger than military spending. Okay, so where does all this lead? In Peter Schiff's view, this toxic mix of debt and inflation has created the perfect conditions for the next big storm. He thinks it has backed the Federal Reserve into a corner, setting the stage for a major crisis. And this, right here, is the trap. Schiff argues the Fed is totally paralyzed. See, if they raise interest rates to fight inflation, they risk setting off a domino effect of bank failures, kind of like what we saw with Silicon Valley Bank. But if they cut rates to try and save the banks and juice the economy, they risk unleashing runaway inflation. They are truly stuck between a rock and a hard place. This no-win situation leads to Schiff's really ominous prediction, a return to the stagflation we saw back in the 1970s. And that's pretty much the worst of all worlds. You get a shrinking economy and rising unemployment, but at the same time, the prices you pay for everything still keep going up. He even warns that it could be much worse this time, maybe even an inflationary depression. So given this really grim forecast, what's the solution? What can you even do? Well, this brings us to our final section, Peter Schiff's way out. See, he's not just a critic. He has a very clear strategy for how he thinks people can protect themselves from the storm he sees on the horizon. His entire solution really centers on one thing, gold. He calls it the people's money because it wasn't created by some government decree. It was chosen naturally by societies over thousands of years. It's a real physical asset with real value that crucially can't be printed into worthlessness. And he often points out that central banks all over the world are quietly doing the same thing, trading their dollars for physical gold. Now, it's really important to separate his view on gold from his view on Bitcoin. Schiff is famously very critical of crypto. As you can see here, he sees gold as this solid foundation, but he thinks Bitcoin is a house of cards. To him, it isn't digital gold at all. It's just a speculative gamble with no real underlying value, fueled by hype and a huge risk of catastrophic losses. So how does this all translate into a practical strategy? Well, Schiff breaks it down into 3 parts. First, for savings, he advises holding physical gold and silver that you personally control, not just paper certificates. Second, for growth, he suggests investing about half your portfolio in gold and silver mining stocks. And third, for balance, using the other half for international dividend-paying value stocks outside the US. And that brings us right back to where we started. On the one hand, you've got the official story of a strong, resilient economy. And on the other, you have Peter Schiff's incredibly detailed warning of an impending crisis. So the question is, in this uncertain economy, which story do you choose to believe? And maybe more importantly, what are you going to do about it?